Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the final speaker for today, Dr. Paul Gignac. He's a professor of anatomy and paleontology at Oklahoma State University, and I think he's going to help answer some of those questions about T-Rex feeding that we had through the afternoon. Take it away, Paul.
Thank you very much, Randy. Thank you everyone for staying until the last talk. This is research that's been published, so I'm happy to have you take pictures of the slides, post them on social media if you'd like. This is work that I've done with Dr. Gregory Erickson at Florida State University as part of a long-term project trying to understand the unique feeding abilities of some dinosaurs. So most vertebrates are incapable of biting through bone. They don't have the bite forces or the tooth form that's necessary to pull this off. Exceptions to this are carnivorous mammals. So you might recognize some of these, the spotted hyena or the gray wolf. These are animals that have incisors and cheek teeth that fit together really well. And that makes it possible for them to break down bone while they're feeding. If you happen to have your own pet carnivorous, you might have noticed this kind of behavior where they use localized repetitive biting or gnawing. And it's a very mammalian way to feed, and it helps them break down the very durable types of foods that they encounter, especially the bones of their prey, or the rawhides and chewies that you give them. Reptiles don't really have this ability. So for the most part, reptiles have very simple teeth that don't interlock. They have very poor attachment to the jaw, and in the case of birds, they don't have teeth at all. And so these animals are ill-equipped to be able to handle the very durable types of tissues that mammals are able to feed on. Exceptions for this include animals like Komodo dragons, which are able to leave shallow scores on bone when feeding, or blunt-toothed crocodilians, which have the ability to break through and crack open bone, although they don't do that kind of fine fragmentation or gnawing that we think of as mammals. And then some birds, like vultures, which are able to drop bones from great heights, crack them open, and gain access to bits of bone fragments or the bone marrow that's inside. Now, in all of these cases, these reptiles, much like their mammalian counterparts, have very low stomach acidity, about 1.5, and so they're able to chemically digest the bones that they consume. Dinosaurs had some of these abilities as well. So we know from trace fossils, so records of the behavior of predatory dinosaurs, that some were able to leave scores on bone like Komodo dragons, or even leave deep puncture marks like crocodilians. Now, the most remarkable set of animals to be able to do this are tyrannosaurids, in particular large tyrannosaurids like T-Rex. These animals had the largest teeth of any dinosaurs, and they were capable of scoring, deeply puncturing, and even slicing through bone. And we know this by looking at the trace fossil record of the types of behaviors that have been fossilized through the interactions that animals have had with, like T-Rex have had with their prey. So for example, we've seen the end portions of large Tyrannosaurus rex teeth broken off and left in their prey items or animals that they've scavenged. And we've seen examples from a very unique type of fossilization, which are called coprolites. For those of you who don't know, this is essentially dinosaur poo that's been fossilized. And there are paleontologists who spend their careers trying to understand what's inside dinosaur poo. It's a rich source of information about what types of food or animals predators might have been consuming. And in the case of tyrannosaurs, large-bodied tyrannosaurs in particular, we see bits of acid-rounded bone in their coprolites. So we know that they were able to swallow and digest very small bits of bone fragments, and that they were gleaning some amount of nutrients from those bone fragments. They're smooth and acid-rounded, suggesting that they had the stomach pH that was like modern carnivorous mammals and those few reptiles that consume bone, and so they were able to get nutrients out of these. We also see from bite marks left on large portions of bone, like this Triceratops pelvis, which has more than 80 bite marks attributed to T-Rex, that there are regions where it seems that tyrannosaurs were able to use a very focal, localized biting to remove portions of bone, much like you would recognize as a modern carnivorous mammal gnawing on a piece of bone. And so they seem to be doing this behavior that's very unexpected for reptiles, something much more akin to what carnivorous mammals do. And so one of the areas that we were interested in is trying to address this question of how was T-Rex able to do this? How was this large reptile capable of effectively chewing up bone much more akin to what a mammal would do compared to a reptile. And so to understand this, the working group that I'm part of turns to living animals for a vast majority of our research. We try to understand how modern animals work, and then we use them essentially as time machines to go back into the fossil record. And so for a lot of this work, we focused on trying to understand the feeding biomechanics, the way that the feeding system worked in alligators and crocodiles, which are living cousins to dinosaurs. Now, if you're not aware, hatchling alligators are absolutely adorable, but they don't stay this way for very long. And as they grow, they begin increasing their abilities, and particularly their bite forces, which allows them to shift through a number of different diets during growth. So initially, alligators and crocodiles start out being insectivorous, so they mainly eat insects. But as they grow, they quickly begin eating fish and small vertebrates. Eventually, they become large enough to take down terrestrial vertebrates like birds or large game, so think boar or deer, or in the case of this Nile crocodile, a wildebeest. And then the largest crocodilians have the extreme abilities to routinely crush armored prey such as turtles. And so we thought this was a great system to look at. A group of animals that has the ability to bite through bone that's living today, which we can then try and understand and use as a lens to look at T-Rex and see how it was able to chew up bone. Now, in particular, the aspect of the life cycle we're interested in is the adult of the crocodilian, in order to see how it was able to leave these puncture marks in bone. And although these animals couldn't chew up bone, this was a great starting point to understand how a reptile could pull this off. Right, so to do this, we went out and measured bite forces for all 23 living species of alligators, crocodiles, caimans, and gharials. And we use what's essentially a bite force meter. It's a very expensive bathroom scale. And these animals are aggressive and interested in biting, and they think that they're biting us. And so when we place this bite force meter in their mouths, they instantly bite down. They give us aggressive bites that very consistently show at the maximum abilities that they have. And so through this research, we've started to get an understanding of just how this extreme performance in a modern archosaur can come about. And so what we found is that large crocodiles, like a saltwater crocodile, can generate nearly 4,000 pounds of bite force. And to put that into some perspective, a typical adult human male can generate only about 250 pounds of bite force. And so if we're putting this in sort of analogies that you can recognize in every day, being bit by a saltwater crocodile is much like being pinned beneath a 2018 Ford Mustang GT. Let's fix that hood ornament. Okay. Now, by comparison, if you happen to be an adult male in the audience, I'm sorry to say, you're much more like a Vespa. So these are impressive animals with impressive abilities that allow them to move into niches and occupy a place in the food chain as apex predators that's very different from any other animal alive today. And that was part of the intrigue in trying to study them. Now, just to give you an idea of sort of runners-up in this area, I often get asked what are the bite forces for a lot of other predators. Well, the American alligator sits just below the saltwater crocodile at about 3,000 pounds. For mammals, the hyena is the record holder at about 1,000 pounds, and the list goes on. If you happen to have a pet carnivore at home, it's probably able to bite slightly less forcefully than you can at about 150 pounds. Now, to understand how this system works, we dive into the anatomy of these animals, and we looked at how their jaw muscles are arranged in order to understand how they generate these several thousand-pound bite forces. Alligators and crocodiles have 8 groups of jaw muscles on each side. That's twice as many as we have. And that's part of the story of how they're able to pull off this unique ability. In order to get at this arrangement of jaw muscles, we've turned to new X-ray imaging techniques that allow us to peer inside the heads of alligators and crocodiles and then build digital models of the arrangements of their jaws. So this section here through an American alligator is right at about the palate. Here are some jaw muscles, and this video is going to play moving upwards through the head. And what you're seeing are the jaw muscles spreading out. They're highlighted by these pink arrows. They run anteriorly within the snout, and they're located back behind the eyes, so they span a wide portion of the heads of these animals. And so they're using a lot of muscle power in order to generate these remarkably high bite forces. And so in order to understand where the ability to generate 3,000 and 4,000 pound bite forces comes from, we generate mathematical models that are based on the muscle physiology, the muscle anatomy, and the studies we've done measuring bite forces in these animals. And I want you to think of this model essentially as a weather model. We collect a whole bunch of data, and then we put all of that data into a set of equations, and the equations tell us what kind of force, in this case, our American alligator example, would be able to generate. And we wanted to figure out how this worked so we could take a model that in a modern species, we figured it out correctly, and then we would confidently be able to apply it to a fossil taxon. And so in order to do that, we compared our model results, those are shown in blue, with the measurements that we took from living alligators and crocodiles, and we basically were able to show that our modeling approach is accurate, which means we can now use the model to try to understand other animals that have a similar type of jaw arrangement like an alligator or a crocodile. And so that's where Tyrannosaurus rex comes in. So with these data in hand, we then dive back into the fossil record, and we try to parse out what's going on with T-Rex and understand how it was able to generate bite force and what that meant for its ability to have this mammal-like chewing capacity. And so to do this, we sampled the entire adult size range of T-Rex. Now, if you are a museum nerd, you'll notice that these specimens come from all over North America, from Chicago at the Field Museum, or California at the LA County Museum, the Museum of the Rockies, the Black Hills Institute, and the Royal Tyrrell Museum. And these institutions helped us by allowing us to sample these specimens so that we could take measurements on the dimensions of the skulls and the attachment points for the jaw muscles so that we could build a reconstruction of what the jaw muscles of T-Rex would look like. To do that, we rely on modern animals, so our alligator and crocodile models, but also birds, which are living dinosaurs, share a similar arrangement of their jaw muscles. So we can take the two and work out what an intermediate set of jaw muscles might look like by combining it with the skull features of T-Rex. And so this then allowed us to infill digitally the skull with virtual muscles. So we could figure out how big the muscles are, how long they were, where they were placed, and then we could give those digital muscles the features that muscles have in order to understand how they generate force. And so this is our muscle model for T-Rex. This model includes aspects of how the muscles contract, like in alligators and crocodiles, which we've learned from doing experiments on them. It incorporates the arrangement of muscles that's typical for archosaurs, so dinosaurs, but also crocodilians and birds. And it allows us to predict what the bite force would be at any tooth position. And for us, we're most interested in these largest teeth, which are the first to engage prey during biting. They're the ones that are going to leave the initial bite marks. And so they're really the primary tools of T-Rex. And so we looked at what bite forces would be generated out of these teeth. Each of these jaw muscles is much like what we found in our American alligator examples, and so we utilized those living parameters and put them into our T-Rex model. And so just like we had for alligators and crocodiles, then we have a model for T-Rex that incorporates important aspects of its skull morphology, aspects of the jaw muscles that we've interpreted that allow us to essentially bring this animal to life and try to figure out its performance ability and compare that to what we now understand alligators and crocodiles and hyenas and gray wolves do. And what we found is that bite forces for adult crocodilians, or adult T-Rex, range from about 4,000 to almost 8,000 pounds. And that's much more forceful bites than we have for any living animal today. To give you a kind of context of this, so a saltwater crocodile, we said that was a Ford Mustang GT. Well, then a T-Rex would essentially be a monster truck. So being bit by a T-Rex would be the equivalent of being pinned beneath a monster truck. That's pretty amazing. But that's not the only part of this animal that we were interested in. We also wanted to understand how it was using its teeth along with these bite forces to have this kind of mammal-like ability to chew on bone. And so to do this, we worked out a parameter called tooth pressure. And this is essentially how you apply that 8,000 pounds of bite force across the contact of the tooth with bone. So it's not just how forcefully you can bite, whether you can generate 4, 5, or 8,000 pounds of bite force. It's how your teeth are shaped that allow you to then apply that force to the bone that you're trying to bite through. Blunt teeth aren't very good at cracking bone, but pointy teeth are great at it but they also risk being broken off because they're fragile. So something like a T-Rex is sort of an intermediate shape where it's pointed, but it's also very robust. It's a conical shaped tooth, which gives it sort of the best of both worlds. So to do this, we calculated the pressures that T-Rex would be able to generate along its teeth. And what I really want you to know here is that bone fractures at about 65 megapascals. This is determined from doing experimental loading tests in engineering facilities where we can look at how bone breaks under different conditions. And when we looked at our T-Rex teeth, what we found is that a big portion of T-Rex teeth can generate these pressures. A full 1.5 inches of these lethal bananas were capable of puncturing bone, which is far deeper than any animals that we have alive today. Although these pressures are similar to what we see for alligators and crocodiles, their teeth are not nearly as big as what we see for T-Rex, and so we don't think they have this similar type of ability. Overall, what we found is that adult Tyrannosaurus rex could indent their teeth from about 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches. Essentially, as these animals got larger, they gained a greater ability to sink their teeth into bone. In addition, T-Rex teeth aren't just cones, they're serrated. So the fronts and backs have these serrations which would have acted as stress concentrators. So as the teeth are indenting into bone, these portions of the tooth would have generated more stress at their contacts, which would have caused bone to fail more easily. And in particular, the directions that these serrations are in would have driven cracks towards adjacent teeth along the jawline. So after the first tooth engaged and other teeth began engaging into bone, we would have seen that these cracks would have been directed towards each other from one tooth to the next, which would have given T-Rex effectively a high-pressure shearing arcade, allowing it to then generate shearing fractures along large plates of bone, which explains how we're seeing this repetitive biting behavior in something like a Triceratops pelvis. How this is possible really has to do with the unique attributes among dinosaurs that T-Rex has for its teeth. And this is true in other large tyrannosaurs, although they're taken to an extreme in T-Rex. These teeth are elongate, so they're able to puncture deeply into bone. They're semi-conical, so it gives them the ability to resist fracturing as they're indenting with bone. Those serrations help to generate a high-pressure fracture arcade, which really is the main thrust of how T-Rex was able to do this localized biting. They're rooted, and so they're very well implanted into the skull. That helps them resist impact forces with bone. And like sharks, T-Rex was able to regenerate its teeth. This is true for modern crocodilians and dinosaurs as well. So they were replacing their teeth every couple of years. As they got worn down from engaging with bone, they essentially would just replace them and come up with fresh new teeth that were pointier and able to do the job all over again. So when we look at all of these data together, trying to understand how alligators and crocodiles feed and how T-Rex fed, what we found is that T-Rex was able to generate nearly 8,000-pound bite forces, something akin to the weight of a monster truck. And that it could sink its teeth a full 1.5 inches into bone, which gave it this unique ability, or for large tyrannosaurs in general, this unique ability to bite through bone and really develop this localized repetitive biting behavior, much like mammal gnawing, that was not something other dinosaurs could do. And so when T-Rex would come across, whether it's a prey item or scavenging a carcass on the landscape, it would have been able to exploit the entirety of that animal, not just the fleshy bits. And so it would have been better equipped to feed on a wider range of food resources than other large carnivorous dinosaurs. And that certainly gave it an advantage on the Cretaceous landscape. And so as you go home and you tell your family and friends what you learned at DinoFest today, I want you to tell them that you learned that T-Rex was essentially the Clifford the Big Red Dog of the Cretaceous. It was a large carnivore that caused a lot of trouble, and it had this mammal-like gnawing ability, and certainly that helped it become the king of its domain. Thank you all very much, and I have a lot of people to thank you. So for something like duck-billed dinosaur or Triceratops, pretty similar. So we know that the the stiffness of bone, which is really the feature that matters, hasn't changed much since fish moved onto land. There are some exceptions like the bones that John talked about that get very dense. Those are become more difficult to indent. But for most vertebrates, their cortical bone is very similar. So we actually use modern artiodactyl bone, cows and deer, as representatives of ornithischian dinosaur bone when we do engineering tests, because the microstructure is similar and the material properties were likely similar as well.
Okay.
I'm always interested in the different lengths of the teeth and the skulls. If a tyrannosaur or some other dinosaur were allowed to grow its teeth without wearing breakage, would they all be the same length?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Probably not. So we see in alligators and crocodiles today, they do something similar where they have waves of different length teeth, and that a certain tooth socket is larger for a longer tooth, like a caniniform or canine-like tooth. And then in the back, where they're all more molar-like in crocs, the larger sockets are also for larger teeth. And so it's likely that the tooth itself is sort of destined to a certain size, and that they're not being worn down like a file. That's the size of the tooth. And so in the case of T-Rex, the large teeth that are towards the front of the jaw, the largest is surrounded by slightly smaller but also large teeth next to it, and so on. And this would have provided essentially a uniform set of a wave of teeth that could indent first the largest tooth, then in sequence the ones around it, giving it sort of a combined effect of all of the teeth working together. So you don't tend to see that long teeth are interspersed between short teeth. They tend to be grouped together because they're used together during feeding. That's a great question. So one of the things we don't know is what was happening with juvenile or hatchling T-Rex. We don't have a great sample like we do for adults. We presume that because our smallest adult has a 4,000-pound bite force, that probably, as these animals were growing, they were also increasing their bite forces as well. Whether that happened, like with alligators and crocodiles, faster than just body size alone would predict, that's something we don't know yet. And that's one of the areas we want to go in our next steps of research.
So with other Tyrannosaurus species, has there been research done on their bite forces, and were they able to generate really massive bite forces just like T-Rex?
We presume so, although there haven't been a lot of studies that have explored that specifically. But Daspletosaurus, Gorgosaurus, and Albertosaurus all have either bone fragments from their coprolites, bone fragments in the places where their stomachs should be, or they've left bite marks on their prey. And that all implies they had a similar ability to eat bone. Where that starts along the evolution of Tyrannosaurs is a really interesting question. Presumably there's a size in early Tyrannosaur evolution when these animals may have switched to relying more on chomping on bone. We have no idea when that happened yet. But we've got a very nice resolution among Tyrannosaurs with a lot of recent fossils that have been found that may give us an ability to start looking at that question.
I've always been kind of wondering, how do they close their mouth? The teeth interdigitate, or do they come out kind of to the side, learn how to fit together like a crocodile, they see the teeth outside the lips, sitting out there? Is that how they look? You don't see that when you see movies about people. They look like they got a nice dentition, you know, they don't look all kind of goofed up and hanging out the side of the mouth like you've seen a crocodile.
So in a crocodile, their teeth are typically going to interlock to some degree. In an alligator, they have what your dentist would call a class 3 overbite. And so you only see the upper teeth, and that's the case with T-Rex as well. And so the upper jaw was wider than the lower jaw. And so those lower teeth would just sit in just slightly inside. And in fact, they leave marks where they rubbed up against the inside of the jaw. And so we know where they were placed when the jaw was closed. So this is a question of essentially, does T-Rex have lips or not, and would that cover up the teeth? But one thing that you'll see in very older museum exhibits, it's not done anymore, that the teeth would get pulled out quite a bit just to make them look more fearsome. And they're not always quite as long as you think they are. In reality, there probably was some amount of tooth that you would see even with big lips on a T-Rex. But that's something that paleontologists actually debate, just how lippy T-Rex were. And that's a debate that I think is going to be ongoing.
You mentioned that a T-Rex tooth could impart about 1,000 gigapascals at point, but at what point does a tooth fail? Like, would it fail at that force or survive?
So enamel is the stiffest material that vertebrates are capable of producing at all, which is why we put it as caps on our teeth. That enamel is very robust to indenting things that are sort of ceramic-like a bone. And until you start to fracture your own tooth, a tooth cap will be able to indent bones multiple times. What would happen in animals like T-Rex or crocs and alligators is that they'll spall or they'll break off the tip of their tooth, which happens as the teeth get worn. It doesn't tend to happen right away, but over time, just through use, that'll happen. When enamel's pristine, it's great at indenting bone, but over the lifetime of a tooth, it'll start to wear down, and that's partly why we think it was beneficial for them to be replacing their teeth on a regular basis, because they could then introduce a brand new tooth into the same tooth position and start using it all over again.
There's a lot of debate right now about the validity of NanoTyrannosaurus as a taxon. Did it make it into your data set?
It did not, because there's a lot of debate about NanoTyrannosaurus and the validity of its taxonomy. If it turns out to be a juvenile T-Rex, it would be a fabulous organism to look at for trying to understand the ontogeny of this system. If it doesn't, it would be a fabulous organism to look at to try to understand the evolution of this system. So one way or another, it's an animal that I'm interested in, and how we interpret what that animal means for T-Rex feeding, either in its evolution or its ontogeny, will end up coming down to whether or not it's truly its own taxon. I do not have an opinion on it.
All right, well, let's thank Paul and all the speakers.